a look of silence, and I think there will be a lot of questions. But there are some questions I want to raise, and then maybe we can have some time if we have some time that other people will have some questions. One thing is not exactly in the films, but around the films, in interviews, you make suggestions that you find a relation between the perpetrators that you have been interviewing and filming in Medan and the Dutch, the protectors of the Dutch, or the people who were working together with the Dutch in the colonial era. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. Of course, I've only filmed perpetrators in North Sumatra, or mainly in North Sumatra, so please do not take what I say as a scientific assertion about the situation across Indonesia. I think what I've said, what you've probably read, is that many of the perpetrators, indeed all of the perpetrators whom I filmed, with whom I was able to understand something of their background, came from families that opposed the independence of Indonesia from the Dutch. Adi Sulkatri, one of the perpetrators in the act of killing, Adi Sulkatri is somebody whose father worked for the Dutch, first as the head of the colonial bank in North Sumatra, and then as the head, I think regionally, of the Ministry of Opium. Mm-hmm. There was, I guess, an opium ministry, just as there was in China, where the colonial authorities must have been, I don't know much about it, I just know they must have been found it in their interest to get part of the population addicted to opium, just as the British did in China. I also know that, for example, Sharman Sinaga, one of the perpetrators in The Look of Silence, talks about the man, in fact, the very first one you see that Adi's watching on television, and then who you see again showing how he demonstrating how he would kill women on his own wife. His father was, Sharman was proud to tell me, an assassin for the Dutch, and had learned, in fact, this strategy of drinking blood while working for the Dutch as a hitman. I think again and again I found that perpetrators' families personally had supported the Dutch regime and were opposed to the Indonesian Revolution. And I came to understand through my knowledge of what economic system was put in place by the New Order, that essentially the 1965 killings you could see as a kind of counter-revolution, where the Indonesian Revolution was stopped in its tracks. It was not the sort of economic and political reforms that were being demanded, the anti-colonial reforms that were being demanded and fought for from 1945 onwards. You could argue that they were incomplete, and that they were finally really stopped in the late 50s when martial law was declared in response to the Outer Islands Rebellion, the so-called PRRI and Permesta rebellions, and that the military more or less began to take power in the late 50s, and in 1965, through the extermination of the Indonesian left, they consolidated that power and took complete power. But you could argue that what happened in 1965 was that the Dutch colonial system was reinstated, only now the army rather than the Dutch were in the position of colonial masters. And you could also argue that what had been a profitable field, especially for Dutch private corporations, was opened up to British and American and other foreign corporations, and then their Indonesian counterparts, run by more often than not army officers or their cronies.
But it means in a way that you say that the 1965 killing and the event was a final event to re-establish the power of the military that was coming up already from the 1950s. But when the military is coming from the anti-colonial movement, because the military is the 1945 generation, that would mean that those were the people who are in favor of the independence of Indonesia and against colonialism.
I think, they were in favor of the independence of Indonesia from the colonists, but it's not clear that they were in favor of dismantling the exploitative ultimate the feudal stroke colonial economic system that had been built by the colonists. They perhaps were simply trying to take the place of that the Dutch had occupied in dominating the society.
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely after 1965, the Dutch were one of the first countries that wanted to support Indonesia again for financial reasons, but we will come to that later. Well, there's a lot of things going around with your films in Indonesia. What do you think that's the possible impact of your film on the process of reconciliation or democratization in Indonesia?
Well, a film cannot change a country's destiny. It simply cannot. I think, though, the act of killing helped to catalyze a transformation in how the media in Indonesia, and therefore the general public, talks about the past, where the mainstream media, parts of the mainstream media that had previously been silent on the genocide, now speak about the killings as a genocide, as a crime against humanity, and talk honestly about the legacy of the killings in the present. And into the space opened by the act of killing. You see, the act of killing began its life in secret, but by the end of its life, really, and by the end of its real release in Indonesia, it had been screened thousands of times, and then we made it available for free download, free streaming inside Indonesia. It's been downloaded millions of times, and into the space opened by that has now come the look of silence, showing how torn the social fabric in Indonesia is by fear and by mutual suspicion, and how urgently needed are truth, reconciliation, some form of justice, and ultimately healing. So I think that because the space was already opened by the act of killing, the look of silence has had a much wider release, at least initially, inside Indonesia. The very first day of screenings across the country, there were 500 screenings. That quickly went up into the thousands. Now I think we're at something like 3,000 screenings or more. We estimate that hundreds of thousands of people, we know that we've had reported back to us from people organizing screenings that at least 120,000 people have come to screenings, but we know that many screenings the majority of screenings in fact don't tell us how many people came. So we estimate hundreds of thousands of people have seen the film already before it's been put online. It was widely reported. There's been interesting things that have happened with the film in response to its the big discussion that it generated, particularly at the end of last year and then in January. The army started to organize groups of thugs to threaten to attack screenings. Mm-hmm. And then the police or the army would say, you must cancel this screening because we cannot guarantee the safety of the audience because thugs have threatened to attack it. Not saying usually, although often one could tell this to be the case, not saying usually that the army had organized the thugs to threaten to attack the screening. About 30 screenings were canceled in that way. No one was hurt, but it was a sign, the pattern was very consistent from the smallest village to the largest cities. It was the same pattern, and so it was clear there was some kind of army intelligence operation against the film. At the same time, and then the censorship board, at the request of the police in East Java, the police in Malang, so the city police of Malang, the censorship board, the film censorship board, banned the film for public cinema screenings, and that's now being appealed by the National Human Rights Commission and been reported widely in the newspaper as an unlawful and regrettable decision. So that may change, but that was at the request of the police that the film was banned. Finally, and yet screenings continue. So after the film was banned, screening at the National Islamic University in Yogyakarta, there was a large screening organized. The police and the university demanded that the screening be stopped because thugs had allegedly threatened it, but the students barricaded the entrance to the university and went ahead with the screening without incident. So that was a wonderful moment of resistance to the power of the thugs. Yeah. And then one other notable screening took place around the same time, I think this was in early March, when an army general in central Java, in Semarang, ordered his soldiers to watch the film and held several screenings for ultimately hundreds of soldiers. It was a mysterious decision on the part of the army, on the part of his general. He never really explained why he was doing it, but I'm sure the film affected the soldiers as much as it affects anybody else. I guess I would say that the film, The Act of Killing, opened the conversation, or helped to open the conversation, because I'm certainly not the only person to try and address these issues. The Look of Silence, through the efforts of all the people or distributing the film in Indonesia, have taken that conversation forward to a question of how do we live together, how do we rebuild the damaged social bond. But whether there will be the Truth Commission, the reconciliation process, and to what extent there'll be healing and the revision of the national school curriculum is really up to the people of Indonesia. It will take a struggle, I believe.
But if just for at the end of your Look of Silence, when you're getting towards the end, I think the film comes more confronting. Adi is going to confront the perpetrators, or the relatives of the perpetrators, more with the story of what the father told you earlier. And I think at the end you even put the laptop on the table and you say, you're in fact you're saying you're lying. It's there. Here's the evidence.
Right.
Does it? I wonder why did you go that far at the end of the film, and then. Is that the kind of direction that you want to point for the reconciliation, or because it gets a little feeling of a tribunal?
Yeah, no, I certainly don't see that scene as a model for what should happen in Indonesia. There's a story behind that scene, and perhaps that helps, and then I can explain why the scene is there and what I feel it shows. I had spent 3 months with Amir Hassan, the death squad, the father in that family who had died since 2004. I had spent 3 months with him, with his wife, and with those 2 sons, dramatizing the book that he's written, that memoir that he's written, that Adi is showing them. So it never occurred to me, I never imagined that family might deny knowing about what the father did. It was unimaginable to me that they would even try to deny it. So the whole idea with that scene was that what we planned and what we hoped would have happened was that Adi would go and say, look, you know who I am, because we're from the same village. I know who you are. It's not your fault what your father did or what your late husband did. And yet we have to live together. We have to find a way of living together. My daughter might one day marry your son or your grandson. How should we live together? And this was the point, this was our purpose in shooting that scene. But because they recognized Adi, because they knew who he was, they, I guess, became afraid, and they denied knowing anything about the killings. I was astonished, as I said, that they did that because, as I said, I'd spent 3 months full time working with that family to dramatize what the father had done in a kind of dry run or sort of dress rehearsal for what I would later do with Anwar Congo in making The Act of Killing 1.5 years later, or about 1 year later. We started that process with Anwar. And so I just never imagined they would deny knowing about the killings. And when they did, I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to trap them. I wasn't trying to humiliate them by forcing them to admit they were lying. I was actually simply trying to get past the denial so that we could have the conversation for which we had come. I was trying to get to the starting point of the dialogue for which Adi had come. And I sincerely hoped that by showing them that footage, they would say, okay, yes, of course we know this, let's talk. And it didn't work. They became more and more angry. Yeah. And leaving at the end of that scene, when we finished shooting the scene, I left feeling like we had nothing. Like this was a scene that would end up on the so-called cutting room floor. We wouldn't be able to use it. But then when I looked at the material, I realized actually this scene shows so tragically, so desperately, the abyss of fear that divides neighbor from neighbor. that it's not only the survivors who are afraid of the perpetrators, which we've seen very clearly throughout the film, but the perpetrators and their relatives are afraid of the survivors, and that this horror festers like a wound and keeps people separate from each other. And I felt that, I could have ended the film in the scene just before that where Adi meets the daughter of a perpetrator who has the courage, the humanity, the dignity to apologize on her father's behalf. I could have ended there. That would have been a more hopeful ending. The film would have felt more uplifting, to be sure. But I felt it would have been dishonest. In years of doing this work, that daughter was unique. And I felt that what really embodies the state of the nation and shows how urgently needed truth and reconciliation and healing is that final scene. And so that's not there as a model for what should happen. God, no, it was a mess. That scene ended in a mess. I went too far. I don't claim to be... I was hoping to get to a dialogue. Instead, I just made everybody afraid and upset. I chose not to hide that mess, and I chose not to hide the mess for which I was partly responsible there, because I felt it shows, honestly, just how enormous the challenges are ahead.
Yeah. Thanks for reminding. It's in a nutshell the problem, I think, and in that sense, I think it's a very good ending, and thank you for saying that. Honestly, you're part of the creator of that mess. But
and it's the problem of history, isn't it? I mean, it's that we cannot run away from our past. It's interesting because I think there's a speaking to the audience tonight. I'm aware that over the last 2.5 years since I found myself suddenly in the spotlight for a history which really isn't my own history, except insofar as I believe a crime against humanity is a crime against all of us. But over these last 2 years, I've received messages again and again from people in Holland asking me to talk, to look into is it called the Berenschot period?
Yeah.
And one realizes, and there's whole dimensions to this story which I'm only vaguely aware of. Essentially, I think the past haunts us, and whether it's the Dutch oppression or the backlash against the Indo community in Indonesia at the time of the Revolutionary War, the War for Independence, the past violence haunts us. And what I'm really trying to show, perhaps more than anything else, is that we are our pasts, and we are also our relationships with each other. I, as an individual, cannot feed myself or clothe myself or live on my own. I depend on the common family of humanity. We need each other to live, and we need to look after the bonds that tie us together. We need to love each other. We need to care for each other, and we need to recognize that when one human being or one government is violent against another human being or another class of people or another nation, we do such damage, and it lasts for a very, very, very long time.
And we're working with it. And thanks to your films, we have discussions like this. Joshua, thanks very much for being with us at Indomania.
My pleasure.
And we hope to see more films of you and see you again in the Netherlands and have a longer discussion. Thanks.
So, are we done? Are you saying goodbye to me in a very...
Yeah, I'm saying goodbye in a very polite way.
Okay. Thank you all so much, and I'm sorry I can't see you, but I wish I could.
Okay, while Joshua is working on something else again, we're going to continue our discussion here with 4 people. Let me first introduce them. Can we have a little light because it's like we're in a theater. Yeah. Thank you. So I can see you, and if you have questions, we have. Okay, let me first introduce my 4 friends in the panelists. First, Nursyahbani Katjasungkana. She's a founder of a Women's Association for Justice in Indonesia, and she's working in law. You're a lawyer, and also in working on the tribunal for the justice of 1965. We'll come to that later. Saskia Wieringa, she was a professor at the University of Amsterdam, published widely on sexual politics in Indonesia, women empowerment, and so on, and she's also involved in the tribunal. I think we will hear a lot about that today. Leonard Retel Helmrich, a cineast from the Netherlands, who is well known by his trilogy of the, it's here in Dutch, the Stand van de Zon, Maan en de Sterren. And he has been living a long time in Indonesia, has been kicked out of Indonesia in 1995, but is working on daily life in Indonesia. Then Ward Berenschot, he is a researcher at KITLV, the Royal Netherlands Institute for Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. My colleague, my name is Fridus Steijlen, I'm working there also. But Ward is doing research on democratization, clientelism and identity politics, and he just recently came back from Indonesia from more than 1 year field work. Some of my colleagues are lucky. These are the 4 people who are going to talk about democratization in Indonesia and maybe the role of the Netherlands, and I want to have just let's say about 30 minutes, and then I want to invite you to join us in the discussion. But let's first hear what our panelist has to say. Starting with Nur, maybe and connecting to what Joshua's filmed and what he told about the screenings. Can you say something about the receptions of the film in Indonesia of Joshua Oppenheimer and the possible impact? And then,
yeah. Thank you, Fridus, and good evening, everyone. I think Joshua has already said that the more than 500 or 1,000 screening of the act of killing and also look of silence. And in general, the 2 films well accepted by the public, but not by the government. The government officially stated that the look silent of silence and the act of killing was banned by the censor board. But as also Joshua said that the film opened the conversations, usually, especially among the youth, the student. That's a really good impact in terms of that. Since for I think 32 years, we were taught. I was taught the lies of the 1965 massacre, by the government. There are film, books, history textbook, and all the media also involved in the lies of our own history. And now more and more young people keen to know their own history. That's really good. But in terms of the, and for the first time, the National Human Rights Commission launched their report in 2012. But the government...
There was a report on 1965.
Yes, a report on 1965 crimes against humanity. But the government, up to now, keep denying the report. And also the Attorney General Office denied to proceed to the next step for the pro justia investigation. And in 2013, the National Human Rights Commission and also the NGO brought this issue, the issue of denial, to the Human Rights Commission in Genève, where also Mr. Kees Flinterman from Netherlands, one of the members of the Human Rights Committee. And one of the recommendations, because there are many recommendations on human rights in Indonesia, but related to the 95 crimes against humanity and denial of Attorney General Office, it was recommended to establish a joint team investigation between National Human Rights Commission and Attorney General Office. Yeah, and then according to Indonesian law, but up to now the joint investigation never been established. But I would like to explain to you that the step is based on the National Human Rights Commission. The Attorney General Office have to continue the Justicia investigation, and the report have to be presented in the Parliament under Commission 3 on Human Rights and Law. And then the Parliament have to review the report and recommend to President to establish special court. But
not yet.
Yeah, it's a long way to go. So that's why the NGO and the human rights community come to the idea of having or conducting International People's Tribunal. The idea of conducting International People's Tribunal born here in The Hague after discussion with Joshua Oppenheimer, mostly attended by exile here, also the survivor of 65 massacre, and also student, academia, and journalists as well.
Because Saskia, you're the chairperson of the foundation here. Because in the prayer of the foundation, I think the first two sentences are about the films of Joshua. Yeah. So what is the? Can you? How do you take it from there?
How do we take it from there? Well, as Joshua says, a film does society. Changing Indonesian society getting to know, getting to realize its own history is a very long process. We take it from there because we are broadening up the investigation. We are setting up what's called a tribunal of inquiry, and in this tribunal we will have complaints, 9 charges in total, to the government or on forced labor, on rape and sexual violence, etc., 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 etc. With proof, we are there's about 40 researchers, international researchers, Indonesian researchers, half of them Indonesian, are working on this report, are collecting data, are collecting evidence, which we then will present to the panel of judges, international judges, and because I mean the local process, the national process is blocked, we take the next step, the international process, in order to go back again to the Indonesian government. Because the process of change has to be in Indonesia. That's very clear, but nothing is happening there. So that's why this process from outside now.
Kind of tool to stimulate or to, so that there will be a kind of movement.
Yeah, and actually things are happening. I just want to share one little example of things which are happening. I mean, I'm investigating for a very long time this kind of issue. We were showing the Vloek of Silence at the University of Indonesia in January. I was giving a kind of explanation and also talking about my own research. But part of it is, for instance, on the psychological testing that was carried out in collaboration with Nijmegen psychologists and psychologists from the University of Indonesia. And I was saying that this actually has to be continued this research in Indonesia because your own, it was within the psychology department, your psychology department has bloody hands. And just yesterday,